Hello class, this is Chapter 4, Intermediate Sanctions. The objectives we're going to cover in this class are as follows. We will discuss the benefits of intermediate sanctions, describe the continuum of intermediate sanctions. We will identify the sanctions that stand alone and what they contribute to intermediate sanctions. Identify the sanctions as an add-on to probation and what they contribute to intermediate sanctions. We will also identify the sanctions that include incarceration and what they contribute to intermediate sanctions. We will examine the relationship between restorative justice and intermediate sanctions and evaluate the effectiveness and the future of intermediate sanctions. Intermediate sanctions are alternative solutions that were developed by local, state, and federal government officials that enable convicted offenders to avoid the harsh reality of prison. They're designed to fall halfway between straight probation and incarceration. Intermediate sanctions emerged in the 1980s due to three factors. First, the belief that prisons were being overused. The second, prison crowding, or really prison overcrowding. And also wide public support for quote-unquote just desserts sentencing structures. The benefits of intermediate sanctions include, first, that they are cost-effective. They also reduce overcrowding in prisons and jails. They meet the needs of certain offenders. In other words, offenders who don't deserve mandatory sentencing or severely harsh mandatory sentencing structures, yet they do require some form of sentencing. They also can be used effectively with probation and parole violators. Judges are allowed to select from a continuum of sentencing options, and they're able to escalate punishments to fit the crime. And intermediate sanctions are typically administered by probation departments. The continuum of intermediate sanctions can range widely from being forced to pay a small fine to being placed in community corrections facilities. And they can run the gamut from everything including fines, forfeiture, restitution, community service orders, house arrest and electronic monitoring, which is EM, drug courts, day reporting centers, shock probation and split sentencing, residential centers, and boot camps. Let's talk about the sanctions that stand alone and what they contribute to intermediate sanctions. And these are the sanctions, which is the list that I just read off to you. The first one we're going to talk about are fines. These require convicted offenders to pay a specified sum of money. And then there is such a thing as a quote-unquote day fine, which is a fine that represents 1 day of defendant's incomes. Now, as far as fines are concerned, they're traced to early common law practice of compensation and are more commonly used in Europe. There is little research showing fines actually reducing recidivism, and day fines, as I mentioned, are designed to equalize financial impact on offenders. Then there's forfeiture. This is traced to the Middle Ages, where it was a mandatory result of most felony convictions. Civil forfeiture is the confiscated property used in law violations and removing the illegally gained profits from violators. Criminal forfeiture is following conviction, and offenders must relinquish assets related to the offense.
Financial restitution means the completion of monetary payments and/or hours of work in the community. It can be a payment of a sum of money to the victim or public fund for victims of crime based on the crime and the offender's ability to pay. There are methods to keep the wealthy from simply writing a check. It also allows the ability to compensate victims and teach offenders financial responsibility. Offenders without resources may be confined to work release centers where they go out to work during the day and return at night.
Community service requires an offender to work hours at a private, nonprofit, or government agency. These are commonly assigned public service projects that include cleanup work on streets, parks, or in government buildings, volunteer service, and repair jobs in rundown housing. It's initially viewed as a rehabilitative alternative for those who could not pay their own fines or restitutions. Most states now have some form of community service. Now let's talk about house arrest. House arrest orders an offender to remain confined in his or her residence for the remainder of their sentence. This can range from evening curfew to non-working hours to continuous confinement. It's sometimes administered by probation departments and sometimes by court-appointed surveillance officers. It can be coupled with electronic monitoring, other fines, community service, etc. Now let's talk about EM, which is electronic monitoring. The use of electronic equipment to verify an offender's whereabouts during specified hours is the ultimate goal of electronic monitoring. It's usually applied as its own sanction, or sometimes it can be in conjunction with other sanctions. It can also be considered a condition of sentence or pretrial. And there are different types of systems. There are active and passive phone line systems, remote location monitoring, and also GPS or global positioning systems. Now, electronic monitoring today means that approximately 20% of offenders on community-based supervision are monitored through EM. It's relatively low cost and high security, meaning that it doesn't cost a lot to manage, but it is high security in the sense that everyone always knows where that person is. It also helps avoid crowded and dangerous prison conditions. And there are some concerns regarding what's called net widening. In other words, if we let too many people out on electronic monitoring, are we letting too many people out in general? That's considered to be net widening. And there is an ongoing debate about that. Drug courts are designed for nonviolent offenders with substance abuse problems who require integrated sanctions and support services. Federal support, national conference debate on quote-unquote drug reform, and the term drug court entered the lexicon of intermediate sanctions. This was found to produce comparatively lower rates of recidivism. There are other specialized courts that include homeless courts and community courts as well. Now there are day reporting centers, also known as DRCs, which are facilities where an offender who is usually on probation must report every day to participate in counseling, social skills training, and other rehabilitative activities. It involves an increased level of supervision, and research conflicts as to whether DRCs lead to decreased recidivism or not. Shock probation and split sentencing we talked about in a previous chapter. Shock probation means that the offender, his or her attorney, or the sentencing judge can submit a motion to suspend the remainder of a sentence after a felon has served a period of time. Split sentence means the offender serves part of his or her sentence in one sanction and the remainder in another. In other words, they might spend part of it in jail, for instance, and the remainder in a halfway house, just as one example. Now here are a couple of questions for you to consider. One of the most widely used intermediate sanctions is probation. According to a 2012 report, probationers complete their probation obligation between 54% and 70% of the time. Now, what percentage of probationers who successfully complete their obligations are first-time offenders? Another question for you to ask yourself and research is, what are some of the challenges that probation officers face? Now, there are programs reserved for inmates completing prison programs or are on probation and parole. And one of those is a residential community center. And a residential center or residential community center is a center for offenders who frequently offer a last chance before an offender is sent to prison, or they provide a last chance for parole violators who might be also facing prison time. There are also boot camps, which are a military-style facility that are sometimes used as an alternative to prison in order to deal with prison crowding and the public demands for severe treatment. In regards to restorative justice, the focus is on the welfare of victims after crimes while allowing the offender to stay connected to their community. Offenders are to make amends to the victim or society for the harm from their crime. It advocates intensive community supervision. One of the programs involved in this is community conferencing and circle sentencing. Circle sentencing is one form of restorative justice initiative. It aims to recognize the needs of victims, secure the participation of the community, and identify the rehabilitative needs of the offender. Unlike many other restorative initiatives, it is part of and replaces sentencing in the formal justice system. There are also family group conferences, reparation and restitution, and victim offender conferencing. Let's talk a little more about community conferencing and circle sentencing. It was adopted by the criminal justice system in the 1980s. In 1991, George Barry Stewart of the Yukon Territorial Court introduced the concept in order to empower the community to participate in the justice process. Victims, offenders, and community members meet one another to resolve issues raised by the offender's criminal behavior. Then there is the family group conference. The use of a group decision-making model in order to try and stop family violence is the ultimate goal of the family group conference. It has been tested in New Zealand, Austria, England and Wales, Canada, and finally now in the United States. It is used in many countries as a preferred sentencing and restorative justice forum for youthful offenders. Now we're going to talk about reparation and restitution. This is often referred to as the Vermont model of reparative probation. It involves a reparation program that's tracked for low-risk offenders and mandates that the offender make reparations to the victim and the community. And it helps to directly engage the community in the sentencing process and in monitoring offenders. With restitution programs, these are the most popular model of restorative justice. It is best viewed within the larger context of quote-unquote making amends. It encourages a balancing of the scales between the offender and the victim, showing a spirit of generosity and forgiveness on both sides. The key focus is that of the offender offering individuals, families, or communities compensation for losses. Now, here's a new discussion question for you to consider. Is restitution an effective deterrent and intermediate sanction for the rich and famous? What are the potential penalties for failure to comply with a court-ordered restitution? Now, both of these questions are going to involve some reading and research on your part, so please make sure that you do so that you can consider these questions thoroughly and completely. There is also victim offender conferencing, which was introduced into the criminal justice system in the 1980s. It encourages one-on-one victim offender reconciliation, and that is facilitated through a mediator. It is reported that the program has been successfully implemented in places such as British Columbia and Ontario, Canada, Indiana, Minneapolis, Minnesota, New York, and many other places, as well as many nations in Europe. As far as the future of intermediate sanctions, there is an increased cost-effective compliance without net widening, which we mentioned before. These benefits attributed include certainty, celerity, proportionality, and progressiveness. Now, here is a question for you to consider as well. We've talked a lot about restorative justice. Now, what I would like for you to do is make a pros and cons list. And as you make this list, consider the pros and cons of restorative justice. And ask yourself, do you think that this is an effective approach for both the victims and the perpetrators of the crimes? And why or why not? Class, as always, thank you for your time. I encourage you to do as much research and reading outside of the text as possible. And we touched on a lot of topics that will fall outside of the scope of your text. So do some research, do some homework. Take a look at some of these programs and their success in Canada and Europe, and also success where it has been implemented in certain states here in the United States as well. Again, thank you as always for your time. Please contact your instructor if you have any questions, and we'll see you next chapter.